Julie Pace, Washington Bureau Chief for the Associated Press. And thanks for joining us for AP Newsmakers. We're happy to be joined here today by Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Julie.
We've got a great crew of AP journalists here in the room who are going to be joining me and questioning the senator, but we also really want to hear from you. So please make sure to submit your questions for the senator through Facebook Live. So we've got a lot to cover. It's a really busy stretch on Capitol Hill right now, but we're just going to get straight to it and get this out of the way at the top. Your name has obviously been floated by some Trump advisors that I've talked to as a possible CIA director. Is that a job that interests you? Would you take that?
Last time I checked, the CIA has a director. He's doing a pretty good job, and I'm pretty happy serving the people of Arkansas in the Senate. I think I'm making a difference there on things like the tax bill and repealing the individual mandate of Obamacare and helping build up our military. So I'm pretty focused on the work that we've got in this busy month ahead of us. Have
you had any conversations with any people in the Trump administration about potentially taking that job if Mike Pompeo were to move on to bigger and better things?
No, it's all idle speculation, and that, I don't know where it's coming from exactly, but we're focused very much on the work at hand in Congress.
Well, I can tell you it's coming from people in the Trump administration. Do you think Rex Tillerson has done a good job at the State Department?
There's some things with which I agree on Secretary Tillerson. I think the State Department needs reform. It's long needed reform. People in both parties have agreed with that. Not to say that I agree with every single aspect of the reform he's undertaking, but I think it's moving in the right direction. Some policies with which I agree internationally, some that I don't. But ultimately, that's the relationship between the Secretary of State and the President is probably the most important relationship in the cabinet, and that's a relationship that the two of them, have to manage.
You've developed a pretty good relationship with this administration, particularly the President himself, some of the folks who deal with national security and foreign policy. What does that look like day to day, week to week? Are you in pretty regular communication with H.R. McMaster, with the President? And how do you think that you have managed to forge this kind of relationship with this White House?
So some of these people I knew in advance. I knew John Kelly a few years back when he was the commander of Southern Command and recommended him to the President last November. In February, I recommended H.R. McMaster, who I've known for several years and known of for a couple of decades because he's legendary among junior officers in the military. So I recommended him in February to be the National Security Advisor to the President. Some other people in the domestic agencies I've known as well through my time in the Congress. Whenever there's important business at hand, I have something I want to raise with the President or Cabinet Secretary or one of his advisors, I'll call them. Likewise, the President or one of his senior advisors needs to talk to me about something happening in the Senate, they'll give me a ring. I try not to just call up and chit-chat with them for no reason. They're all very busy people, as am I. So I try to be respectful of their time and vice versa. But I can tell you it's a very different situation than it was under President Obama. I think that's the case not just for me, but frankly for a lot of Democrats in Congress as well.
In terms of their own interactions with this administration?
This administration, I think, is much better at outreach to Congress than the last one was.
Have you noticed a marked change in the way that this White House is operating with John Kelly at the helm versus the first couple months of this administration?
So, I have great admiration for General Kelly. When told the President about him last November, he asked me what job should he hire him for, and I said Secretary of State. This is before Rex Tillerson's name had emerged at all. And he said, well, what about DHS? Because we talked and I told him that he was head of Southern Command. I said he'd be great at DHS as well. Both those jobs are well suited for his background at Southern Command. Southern Command covers all of Latin America, south of Mexico, and the Caribbean. It's the least militarized. It's the most diplomatic of all of our regional combatant commanders. General Kelly also has a lot of Washington experience. He was head of the Marine Corps Liaison Office in the Congress. He was the senior military advisor for the Secretary of Defense, both Bob Gates and Leon Panetta. So ultimately, I just said, John Kelly. It's like what Bobby Knight said about Michael Jordan in 1984 when NBA GMs were calling Bobby Knight, who coached the 1984 Olympic team, and said, who should I draft? And Bobby Knight always said Michael Jordan, regardless of what the team needed. If they had a two-guard, they had a shooting guard, said draft Michael Jordan. They said, well, we got a good guard. Maybe we need a forward, we need a center. And Bobby Knight just said, draft him and put him wherever you want to, because he'll be better than anyone else in that position. I kind of viewed John Kelly in that way. So when the President made him Secretary of DHS, I was happy. When the President made him Chief of Staff, I was happy, because John Kelly delivers the mail in whatever job he's in. And I can say that from my perspective, I get a little bit more advance notice. There's more of a heads up. I have a little bit better understanding of what's happening when the administration is, or someone in the administration, to be in touch with me, like if the president's going to be in touch with me. I get a little bit more lead time.
You're not getting the
know.
cold calls in the morning.
Not quite as much, and that's good for the president to have that kind of structure and organization around him, that he's presented with the information and the viewpoints that he needs to make the best decisions. Because every decision he makes is tough. If it was an easy decision, it would have been made at cabinet or sub-cabinet levels. So it's very good that the president has John Kelly there in place to help provide him that kind of structure and organization that any president needs.
We're going to dive into some of those tough decisions on foreign policy in a couple minutes. But as I mentioned off the top, there's a lot that's happening on the Hill right now. So I want to just tick through a couple of the things that you and your colleagues have on your plate. We're about 36 hours away from a deadline to keep the government open. The sense that we get is that there is some momentum towards some kind of resolution, at least for the end of this week. Are you confident that the government will stay open through the weekend?
I believe so. I think there's some haggling in the House of Representatives. It has been the last 2 days about how long that short-term funding bill would last. I think the consensus position was December 22nd. Some people wanted to move it out to December 30th. I don't think 8 days is going to make much difference one way or the other, especially when you put Christmas in between there. But I suspect the House will pass that bill with one of those 2 dates later today, and then the Senate will pass it as well.
As we look then to whether it's December 22nd or December 30th to getting the 60 votes for a longer-term bill, what would you be willing to compromise with Democrats on in order to get across that threshold?
Well, the first thing we have to deal with before we deal with a funding bill is a budget bill. We're still operating under the 2011 Budget Control Act, which is a terrible law and has not served any good purpose. The first 2 years after that law was passed, spending went down, but that wasn't the result of that law's caps and the automatic spending cuts. It was a result of a new Republican Congress that imposed some spending discipline on the Obama administration. But as soon as the law's automatic cuts went into effect in 2013, Congress immediately voted to punt those cuts forward and then to lift the caps and avoid those cuts. And spending has gone up every year since then, so the law hasn't achieved its own purposes of cutting spending. But in the meantime, it's been devastating for our military in particular, but all federal agencies, because they don't have the certainty to plan a year in advance, because we keep getting to the end of the year as we did in 2013 and 2015, and now we're doing again in 2017. Having to pass some kind of bill that raises the caps to avoid those automatic cuts and then implements it with a big year-end spending bill that no one wants. So the most fundamental thing we need to do is to repeal those caps and the automatic spending cuts. I had an amendment to do that in September on the defense bill, something that has been supported by many Democrats, all the Democrats on the Armed Services Committee. Unfortunately, the Democratic leaders in the Senate wouldn't allow a vote on my amendment. Even though we offered them multiple votes on their priority amendments, they wouldn't allow a vote because they wanted to create this kind of situation. So the most important thing that we need to do is to eliminate those caps and the automatic spending cuts. That won't dictate any particular spending level for this year or any future year, but it'll allow our Congress, who was elected by the people in 2016, not to be controlled by the dead hand of the 113th Congress elected in 2010. And then we can have a debate about where military spending should be or where spending should be on other domestic priorities. But we shouldn't be controlled by a law that was passed 6 years ago that has not achieved any good purpose.
Democrats look at this situation and they believe that they have some leverage, and they are looking in particular to try to get something done on DACA through this
That's a ridiculous position, and it won't happen.
Would you vote for a bill that included in giving the Dreamers legal status?
So I'm working on a compromise that will codify DACA, but also mitigate the negative consequences. Look, if you give 700,000 illegal immigrants amnesty because they were by and large brought here through no fault of their own, that's going to have negative consequences. There's no way to avoid that. The first thing it's going to do is to create a new potential chain of chain migration for parents and siblings, and then on and on and on. Second, it's going to encourage more illegal immigration with young children, which is a very dangerous and I would say immoral thing. I mean, imagine being a young mother or father in a place like El Salvador, one of the most dangerous places on earth. And you see people whose children are now getting amnesty because they were brought to the United States 15 or 20 or 25 years ago. What would you risk to get your child here? We shouldn't encourage that. So if we're going to codify the DACA program, we have to mitigate those two negative consequences. The first is to end chain migration, a core part of my legislation, the RAISE Act. The second is to take steps for more enforcement to discourage illegal immigration. So starting on the wall with more security in conjunction with the wall, implementing a nationwide employment verification system, adding more immigration judges or immigration agents or so forth. That's the core part of the compromise. That's not going to happen on a spending bill, and there's no need for it to happen on a spending bill because this 6-month interim period the president created doesn't run out until early March.
So it sounds like you're a no if Democrats try to get a DACA fix into this bill at the end of the year.
It's a ridiculous proposition.
So you're a no.
It's exactly what Democrats used to criticize Republicans for, trying to attach extraneous, unrelated matters that have nothing to do with government funding to a government funding bill.
Let me just pin you down before I turn to my colleagues. You would vote no if a DACA fix ended up in this bill at the end of the year.
I'm not going to have to, but I'll vote no on any DACA legislation that doesn't have substantial reforms that mitigates those negative consequences of codifying DACA.
Let me let some of my colleagues jump in here. Donna.
Congressman John Conyers resigned on Tuesday. It looks like Al Franken will be announcing on the Senate floor this morning that he's going to be stepping down. Do you think Roy Moore should be in the Senate in light of all of the allegations and accusations against him? And I also wonder if you think that the president, who has also faced criticism and complaints, should be held to a different standard.
Well, first, I don't know what Al Franken is or is not going to do today, so I'll have to wait and see like the rest of you. The people of Alabama are going to decide Roy Moore's fate. If the people of Alabama elect him, there's direct controlling Supreme Court precedent that says the Senate and the House has no ability to deny a duly elected candidate their seat in the Senate or the House. Some people have said they might file an ethics committee complaint against Roy Moore, and if that happens, then I have great confidence in people like Johnny Isakson and Chris Coons to review that fairly, and as someone who might have to evaluate the merits, I'll evaluate those at the time. But the people of Alabama are going to make that decision, just like the people of this country made their decision last year on Donald Trump.
Can we just pick up on Donna's last question there, though, about Trump? A lot of lawmakers have said they believe the Roy Moore accusers, whether they think he should be seated in the Senate or not. Do you take that stance when it comes to Donald Trump and the women who came forward at the end of the campaign last year?
I haven't gone back and reviewed all the things they said. I think it's important that any woman feels that she can make a complaint if she's been subjected to sexual harassment, sexual assault that have no place in our society or in the workplace. Each case has to be evaluated on the merits, of course. We shouldn't have trial by newspaper. Everyone should have a chance to adjudicate the evidence and advance their claim or defend their cause. But I haven't gone back and reviewed all those matters from last year.
All right. Mary Claire's been keeping track of our Facebook questions here. What do we have coming in?
So this is a question that relates to Arkansas. Tucker asks how you justify tax hikes on lower income workers in the tax bill that come by 2027, especially since Arkansas has so many workers with lower incomes.
So every tax bracket under our tax bill that we pass in the Senate is going to see a tax break. That's just a simple fact. Come January, their paychecks are going to be a little bit higher because they're going to be having less taxes withheld. And they can adjust their withholding as well because they're going to double the standard deduction. In Arkansas, about 70% of households use the standard deduction. They don't itemize. And that means that a lot of people are going to see a tax cut once they claim the higher standard deduction as well. I know there's lots of fancy economic models about what's going to happen in 5 or 7 or 10 years, but I don't think anybody believes the law that we're about to pass is going to last unchanged for 10 years. In 1986, the last time Congress passed major tax reform legislation, it was changed substantially just 4 years later, after George H.W. Bush went back on his campaign promise not to raise taxes. It was changed again 3 years later when Bill Clinton passed the largest tax increase at the time in the country of our history in 1993. It was changed again 4 years later when Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich reached a pretty sizable tax cut deal as well. So I don't think anyone expects whatever we ends up passing the Congress this month is going to last unchanged for the next 10 years.
Even on the corporate side?
What I do know is that every tax bracket of Americans is going to get a tax cut come January.
You think even those corporate changes that are made to be permanent in this legislation?
All that legislation that passed in 1986 was permanent as well. Not a lot of things permanent in Washington, and no one Congress can bind a future Congress. So any future Congress could make a change to any one of those provisions. But what I know is that we're going to put more money in the pockets of working families in Arkansas and across this country, and it's going to help promote a stronger, healthier, growing economy so people are getting back to work and their wages are increasing.
You've been a big driver of getting the repeal of the individual mandate into the Senate bill. Is it your expectation that that will end up in the final package that we see come out of conference?
Of course. So the individual mandate was held by the Supreme Court in 2012 to be a tax. Even though President Obama, while he campaigned and press for Obamacare, said it wasn't a tax, the Supreme Court held it was a tax. So it's squarely within the four corners of a tax bill. It's the most hated part of Obamacare, in part because it is a regressive tax on working families and poor people. In Arkansas, about 65,000 people were fined by the IRS because they couldn't afford insurance that Obamacare made unaffordable. And 53,000 of those people made less than $50,000 a year. So that's going to be a direct tax cut on people who can't afford their health insurance, and it's going to repeal the most unpopular part of Obamacare.
But what does that do to the healthcare system, given that Republicans this year really struggled and ultimately failed to do anything broader on healthcare? If you repeal the individual mandate, but you can't come back next year with a broader healthcare package.
The concept behind the individual mandate is going to force people to get health insurance coverage. It plainly has not been the case. It plainly has not worked. At the same time, though, it has taken thousands of dollars out of the pockets of poor families who are already struggling to make ends meet, and by definition, dealing with the insecurity and the anxiety of not having health insurance. So we simply need to wipe out the individual mandate, which has been a failure and has fallen most onerously on working families and poor people. And we do need to return to health care. I think that's something that should be on our plate next year because Obamacare is not getting better. It's still getting worse. Premiums are still going up. So I hope we do return to health care in 2018.
Do you think realistically, though, that your colleagues, a lot of them who are going to be up for re-election in a tough cycle, are going to have the appetite to take this on in 2018 when they couldn't get it done in 2017?
You're right. I have a lot of colleagues up for re-election. All those Democrats who voted for Obamacare and supported it are probably going to want to take it up and try to fix their problems before the 2018 midterm elections.
I don't know. They seem okay just letting it go, I think, at this point. All right, we're going to turn to foreign policy. I promised you we would dig into that. Let's start with the president's announcement yesterday on Jerusalem. How does that get the Israelis and the Palestinians any closer to a peace deal?
Well, the peace process hasn't been functioning since 2000. What started in 1993 in Oslo essentially ended in 2000 at Camp David when Yasser Arafat rejected Ehud Barak's extremely generous proposal. So the idea that there's some peace process that's been working and they're on the verge of striking a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians is simply not the case. What the president did, what other presidential candidates promised to do but never followed through on, is acknowledge a fact that is universally perceived and obvious to anyone with eyes, that Jerusalem is and always will be the capital of Israel. Now, that doesn't prejudge some of the outstanding issues. For instance, which parts of the outlying areas of Jerusalem might be part of Israel, might be part of a Palestinian state, what the terms of access and times and so forth for the Old City, the holy sites in Jerusalem would be. Those are still up for negotiation. All the president did was simply acknowledge a fact that is universally perceived, and that it gave the fact that he called Jerusalem the capital of Israel, gave people in European capitals the vapors, says a lot more about those European capitals than it does about Jerusalem.
Do you, though, think that this Kushner, Jason Greenblatt process, which from our colleagues who are in the region, people actually have felt like they were operating in good faith, that Jason Greenblatt in particular was developing a good relationship with the Palestinians, do you feel like this essentially halts that process?
I mean, it's time to stop living in dream castles in the Middle East and acknowledge basic facts that everyone knows are never going to change. Jerusalem is going to be the capital of Israel. There is no right of return of people who were never even, who 2 or 3 generations on were not born inside the borders of modern Israel. It's not a hindrance to peace negotiations to acknowledge these facts. I would argue that it helps negotiations because it concentrates and narrows the issues on which they need to debate and ultimately reach a peace agreement. To leave these kind of things up in the air while at the same time implicitly delegitimizing Israel, saying it's the one country in the world that can't choose its own capital, is not beneficial for anyone.
I'm going to turn it back over to some of my colleagues. Go back to Richard Lardner here.
Good morning, Senator. Do you expect Congress to be able to meet the President's demand to toughen the existing law that governs U.S. participation in the Iran nuclear deal? And if it can't, does that give the President pretext for pulling the U.S. out of the accord altogether?
So I would first dispute your use of the word pretext. It would give him reason to do so, not pretext. The President made the right decision in October not to certify the nuclear deal under U.S. law. And that's not really a matter of compliance. U.S. law requires the president not only to certify Iran's compliance or noncompliance, but to certify that the deal is itself in the vital national security interest of the United States. What I advocated to the president, what he chose to do, was to say that deal is manifestly not in our vital national security interest, putting aside any question of compliance or noncompliance. That's plain to me because, first, it puts Iran on the path to a nuclear weapon. It doesn't block their path to a nuclear weapon. They can obey every single term of the deal and still have a nuclear threshold capability now in a mere 8 to 13 years. Second, it's empowered Iran throughout the region, especially in the last 18 months of the Obama administration, because it's given them so much more money, and especially our European partners are so nervous about Iran walking away from the deal that they're willing to look the other way at Iran's campaign for imperial aggression in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, in the Golan Heights, and so forth, not to mention their support for terrorism as well as their atrocious oppression of their own people. Now, that law also says Congress had a 60-day period to reimpose the pre-existing sanctions by a majority vote. I suggested to the president that we not try to go down that path, that backward-looking path to reimpose all those old sanctions, in part because he already has that power. He can impose all those sanctions himself. Under U.S. law, those sanctions still exist. He can simply decline to waive them. And under UN Security Council resolutions, he can direct his UN ambassador not to accept, rather to veto, the next periodic resolution that waives the UN sanctions. So all those sanctions can be reimposed by the president if he wishes. The better course of action is to give some period of months, it didn't have to be weeks, but it can't be years either, some period of months to allow the Congress, working between the parties, to try to reach an agreement that will strengthen the deal, that will address some of the things that were omitted, like Iran's ballistic missile testing, or address some of the manifest flaws of the deal, like its sunset clauses, or Iran's use of advanced centrifuges in the future. If we can build that kind of agreement, we can once again have bipartisan unity on Iran, the way we did in the early Obama administration when Congress was passing laws unanimously over the president's objection, and we can have transatlantic unity between our European partners and the United States. You know, we're only a couple months into that process now. We have several more months to go. I hope we can persuade our Democrats, our Democratic friends and our European partners to act on some of the very words they've been saying all along, that we need to address these concerns. If we can't, then the president will be fully within his rights under U.S. law and the deal to reimpose those sanctions. And in the meantime, we should be taking every step necessary to stand up to Iran's campaign for imperial aggression in the Middle East.
There's another deadline coming up for to certify in mid-January. What do you expect the president to do?
Well, now that he has declined to certify that the deal is in our national security interest, I don't see how he can do anything other than continue to decline to certify that it's in our national security interest.
You were working on a bill to address some of these issues on the U.S. side with Senator Corker. Where does that stand?
We're still working on it. We're still engaging with our Democratic colleagues as well as our European partners. Look, what some of these European officials don't understand is that their choice is not between the status quo, which they like with their head in the sand, and the terrible Corker-Cotton bill. Their choice is between the Corker-Cotton bill or the president walking away from the nuclear deal. That's what they have to get through their heads and make that decision. I think they and some Democrats are going through the various stages of grief on the president's decision in October, and once they're willing to sit down at the table and negotiate, we have a chance to get a much stronger posture towards Iran's nuclear program and their aggression in the region.
But is there a scenario where the U.S. says we're done with this deal and the Europeans continue on as they have been and continue to deal with Iran?
Well, the president cited that scenario in his speech in October. He called upon Congress to take action to strengthen our posture towards Iran. You know, he asked our European partners to cooperate with us, and he said if that didn't happen, that he would be willing to terminate the deal. Those are his exact words.
What would our relationship look like with some of our allies, though, who we negotiated that deal alongside with, who we count on for help on a variety of other issues?
Well, with all those countries, we have very complex relationships that have a lot of cross-cutting issues. We can have disagreements on one issue and still work together on a lot of other issues. But privately, they all acknowledge what a terrible deal that was. They all agree. Some of them personally were present when John Kerry was negotiating it.
The Brits, the French, they acknowledge to you that it's a terrible deal.
That it has lots of problems, and those problems are in no small part because John Kerry was a bad negotiator and Barack Obama was willing to give away anything to get that deal.
We'll turn to Brad Clapper, who covered a lot of those negotiations there.
I wanted to hear your thoughts on North Korea, and specifically if you feel that the hardline position that you, the president, Republicans have taken on Iran boxes you in on North Korea. If you consider that the deal, for all its flaws or merits, took Iran from a threshold nuclear power in 2013, which is where it was, to a cap of 300 kilograms low-enriched uranium. How do you reach any sort of compromise with North Korea at a time it's sitting on up to 60 nuclear weapons and an ICBM arsenal that could theoretically strike the whole country?
So the proponents of the Iran nuclear deal, who said somehow this made a deal with North Korea harder to achieve, are preposterous. North Korea for 70 years has reached international agreements apparently for the sole purpose of violating those international agreements. We now know that when they struck the agreed framework with the Clinton administration, negotiated by some of the same people that negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, they immediately started cheating on those obligations, immediately started pursuing other paths to a nuclear weapon. So the idea that we're going to have any kind of paper agreement with North Korea that they're going to respect is preposterous. The North Korea situation, though, heightens the danger that Iran poses in the future. So we should look at what's happened in North Korea over the last 25 years and learn the lesson and apply it to Iran. Because a nuclear Iran is much more dangerous than a nuclear North Korea. North Korea is a small and isolated country at the edge of the world. It has no significant economy. It certainly has no export economy. It is surrounded by only 4 nations who are vastly larger and more powerful than it is. And it has no expansionist revolutionary ideology. Iran is at the crossroads of civilizations. It's a much larger country. It has an expansionist revolutionary ideology. It's surrounded by, depending on how you define it or how maybe they define it, 10 to 20 peer competitors, and it has a growing economy with a key export economy. All those things would be much more volatile if you were to introduce nuclear weapons into that geopolitical situation versus the North Korea situation. So we should learn the lessons of what happened in North Korea when you kick the can down the road for 25 years. Across both parties, this is not any one party's fault, and realize that it's better to address these dangers before they gather. They are gathering in Iran.
I want to stick with North Korea. The president has put a lot of effort into trying to get China to put more pressure on North Korea to change its own behavior. Do you think that that's been an error in the administration's position? Do you think they should be looking at Beijing as more of a problem than a partner in this situation?
Yes.
Expand on that a little bit.
So,
why?
So I know the conventional wisdom in Washington is that China wants a denuclearized Korea Peninsula. They've been saying that for 25 years. They've been lying for 25 years. That's what their diplomats do. They lie to Western officials. China benefits from a nuclear North Korea. Why? Because the first question I've been asked in this setting, as is often the case, whether I'm speaking to reporters or speaking to Arkansan, is about North Korea. It's not about China and the things they do, like the economic warfare they're committing against the United States, or building islands and militarize them in the South China Sea, or their the practical diplomatic embargo they're trying to wage against Taiwan, or their atrocious treatment of Christians in their country. As long as North Korea is a nuclear country, the time and effort and energy of U.S. policymakers must be focused on North Korea, not on China. If North Korea was fully denuclearized, it would simply be a weird, closed, totalitarian state, much like, say, Bulgaria or East Germany was in the Cold War, something that we would never have to worry about. So I believe that China wants to have a nuclear North Korea. That's why they've been playing both sides of the street for 25 years, saying one thing to Western officials and in public, but doing nothing to stop North Korea from getting nuclear weapons, or now to get them to denuclearize. So that's why I say that China wants this to happen, and that we shouldn't think that China is some kind of willing partner here. That said, the last thing China wants, even less than a denuclearized North Korea, is a second Korean War. It's going to happen on their borders. That's one reason why they've closed a bridge from North Korea into China. That's one reason why they've started alerting people in Northeast China about how to respond to nuclear fallout. So we should heighten we should heighten the pressure that China faces to help work on this situation, because it would be very hard for the United States alone to remove nuclear weapons from North Korea by anything other than military means.
So what are you advising the administration to change vis-a-vis its relationship with China and the way it's been interacting with them and what it's been requesting of them in order to deal with North Korea?
Well, the North Korean threat is the most immediate threat we have there. So we should start taking actions to mitigate that threat. You saw the way China reacted when we sent one missile defense system to South Korea. Well, if they didn't like that, how would they like 10 missile defense systems sent to South Korea and Japan? You see the anxiety they have when we have multiple carrier groups deployed to Northeast Asia. Well, what if we sent 2 more there? What if we started taking a firmer line on these, some of these economic and trade issues, or on the South China Sea, or opening more channels between our military and Taiwan's military? There are lots of pressure points that we have with China that we can push on. At the same time, we have to prepare for war. George Washington said the most effectual mean of avoiding war and keeping the peace is to be prepared for war. So we need to take further steps like deploying missile defenses, like beginning the drawdown of dependence of military and diplomatic personnel in South Korea.
Do you think that should be happening now?
Absolutely. The military should stop today sending spouses and children to South Korea, and they should gradually draw down the spouses and children who are in South Korea. It's not just a moral issue of putting more Americans in harm's way, but it's a readiness issue. If you've got a private on the DMZ, he should be focused to the north and focus solely on that. He shouldn't be worried about what's going to happen to his young wife and children sitting in Seoul.
Nikki Haley last night even raised the prospect that potentially it was an open question if U.S. athletes should go to South Korea for the Olympics early next year. What do you think about that?
Well, we should make that determination based on intelligence decisions. Obviously, the Pyeongchang Olympics have been a major milestone that South Korea has been working towards for many years. There's going to be, I'd say, an unprecedented security effort there to ensure that everyone is safe, athletes, spectators alike. But if there are credible threats, we have to take those seriously. I'm not aware of any at this point. Of all the things that I imagine Kim Jong-un knows that would bring an end to his regime faster than anything, I suspect imperiling the Pyeongchang Olympics is pretty close to the top of the list.
I'm going to turn it over to Sagar Meghani, who covers the Pentagon for us.
Good morning, Senator. Is there a realistic resolution to the situation shy of the U.S. having to take some type of military action in North Korea? I mean, folks in the Pentagon have talked about how catastrophic that would be with all the North Korean artillery that's aimed right at Seoul. Is there a reasonable expectation that this can be solved shy of the U.S. having to take some type of action?
Well, first, to be clear, there is a military option in North Korea. Just like there is in Iran, there is always a military option, and this country can never say, we don't have a military option, because as soon as we say that, we don't have effective diplomatic options. Obviously, we don't want to have to take military action in North Korea. I don't think that the United States alone, through diplomatic or economic measures, can force Kim Jong-un to denuclearize. That's why it is so important to bring pressure to bear, whether it's through some of the matters we discussed or other techniques to get China to address the issue as well. But until I think China believes that war is imminent, it's hard to see exactly what would cause Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons.
Would you support a preemptive U.S. military strike in the North?
I wouldn't take it off the table. It would depend on the circumstances. But if we have credible intelligence that North Korea has mastered not only ballistic missile technology and nuclear technology, but married those two together and is on the verge of launching a nuclear weapon against one of our allies, or against the United States territories or the United States homeland, then I think most Americans would expect our country to take whatever action is necessary to stop that from happening, and not just depend on missile defenses that, though rapidly advancing in capability, have never been tested in combat.
Do you want to jump back in?
You're about stopping dependents from going to South Korea. Does that signal to South Korea, though, that they're on their own if we're pulling people out? And also a military buildup there, sending more carriers, does that potentially force Kim Jong-un's hand, make him feel as though an attack is coming, so he's gonna strike first before he gets hit?
So the first question is no, simply because we would no longer send dependents to South Korea and would begin to draw down the dependents there. We still have tens of thousands of troops in South Korea as well as in Japan, all of whom are easily ranged by North Korea's long existing missile technology. If anything, I would say it shows our firmer commitment, because it shows that we want our troops who are deployed in that region to be 100% focused on their mission to deter North Korean aggression. And it's hard for them to focus on that if they've got a wife and kids 60 miles behind them who are in range of all those North Korean missiles. So this is, again, it's not just a moral issue, it's a readiness issue for our troops.
Is that something the administration is actively considering right now?
I have no comment on that.
Okay.
Second question, the crisis in North Korea is caused solely by North Korean aggression and North Korea's outlaw nuclear program. Nothing we do in terms of military exercises with South Korea or the deployment of additional carrier groups or withdrawing dependents is provocative to North Korea. North Korea is the one that's being provocative.
You know, Mary Claire, who's not only been keeping track of our Facebook questions, but also probably has some questions of her own.
Yes, so you're on the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is investigating...
An oxymoron?
Yeah, which is investigating Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Do you fully agree with the intelligence community's assessment that there was meddling in the election? And also, have you seen any evidence of collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign?
So sure, I agree that Russia hacked into those emails and released them, either directly or through proxies and cutouts. That's what Russia does. You know, if you're an ardent proponent of hydraulic fracturing in this country, or you supported the nuclear freeze movement in 1983, you were probably influenced by Russian propaganda, because Russia consistently, whether in its Soviet form or in its Putinist form, uses disinformation, subterfuge, manipulation, subversion to interfere with U.S. politics and really the politics of all Western democracies. Second, I'll simply cite Dianne Feinstein, who used to be the chair and the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, is now the ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee. I think most recently, 2 or 3 weeks ago, she said she had seen no evidence of collusion.
And you would agree with that?
I have no reason to doubt what Senator Feinstein, who has even greater access to information through the Judiciary Committee as well as the Intelligence Committee, has concluded.
Do you think the committee will say either way in the end in a final report that there was or was not collusion?
I mean, we'll follow the facts wherever they take us. If we haven't found any evidence of collusion, I don't think that we can say anything other than there's no evidence of any kind of collusion here. There's lots of evidence of malicious Russian behavior, which is, again, what Russians do. That's just the way Russia's government behaves, whether it's the Soviet version of Russia or the Putinist version. But if we have no evidence of it, I would assume that we'd make that statement that there's no evidence of any kind of collusion between Russia and any American.
Given just how polarized our country is right now, we see this when we ask questions about Russia and the investigations in our polling. Do you think that there's anything that your committee can do to put forward to the public that will get beyond these Democratic and Republican divides on this question, that will actually give the public confidence that there's a clear answer to what actually happened in this election?
I hope so, and that's one reason why we've worked so hard to maintain bipartisan comity on the committee, and we have done so. I can tell you behind closed doors, as in the public, our committee has worked together in a very cooperative and cordial fashion on this. That's one reason why I think it's viewed as the most credible committee in Congress that's reviewing these matters. So I hope that we can issue a report that has taken all the facts to their rightful conclusions, whatever those may be, do so in relatively short order, not only so we can hopefully reach that kind of consensus in our country, but also prepare our states for continued Russian interference in elections, which are going to be happening in just 3 or 4 months in some states holding their primaries. And that's a very important matter as well, because Russia is not going to stop engaging in that kind of deception and subterfuge and manipulation. That's what Russia does. That's what they've always done.
Do you think that the states and the federal government are any better prepared today to combat that kind of potential interference than we were in 2016?
I can't speak for each individual state. I mean, our elections are very decentralized in this country, which is actually a defense against that kind of manipulation. I've talked to the authorities in my state, and I've encouraged them to make sure that they have paper ballots for everyone that votes. If they're voting on an electric machine, they always have a paper backup for that. And that the one system that definitely cannot be hacked is an old-fashioned paper ballot and a pencil. There's no way you can manipulate those votes unless you intercept the ballot box late at night, which has been known to happen a few times, but you can't do it from Russia.
Well, our time is winding down here, so let me just ask you at the end. You've now been in Washington for a good bit of time. it is such a polarized climate here. It is such a toxic political environment sometimes. What are some things that you feel like you could do differently to bring more bipartisanship to this town, to have Congress be more effective and actually fulfill some of the things that Americans say all the time they actually want their representatives to do?
Well, in some ways, our society is more divided than it was, 30 or 40 years ago, and that's reflected in Congress as well. Sometimes people ask me, where did all the conservative Southern Democrats go? And the answer is they became Republicans. A lot of people I know in Arkansas, like my parents, grew up as Republicans and or grew up as Democrats, and they feel like the Democratic Party left them, and they produced a Republican son. Likewise, in New England, that New England was the historic home of the Republican Party because we were the anti-slavery party in our founding, and that New England was obviously the home of anti-slavery political opinion in the 1850s and the 1860s. That's changed over time as well. New England is also one of the more liberal parts of our country, and therefore, as the Democratic Party became associated with the liberal political viewpoint, Republicans in New England began to see a decline in their numbers. So some of what we see in Washington is just the result of a political, demographic, ideological sorting out of our country that's been going on for 150 years. Some of it, though, is the result, I'd say, of bad behavior of politicians. Look, you can have very different viewpoints. You can recognize that we represent different kinds of people. I'm willing to concede that Nancy Pelosi is a pretty good representative of most people in San Francisco. I don't think, her politics are not exactly our cup of tea in Arkansas. I think she might say the exact same thing in reverse about me. You can have those kind of fundamental disagreements about taxes or about health care or about defense or so, but do so in a respectful way and not impugn the motives of your political opponents, and acknowledge that most people who run for office are trying to do the right thing and trying to serve our country, trying to serve the people that elected them. So sometimes I think politicians in Washington behave badly towards each other, always assume the worst about their adversaries, and the best about themselves, and to try to see things through each other's eyes or stand in each other's shoes would be helpful for all of us, just like it is helpful in everyday life.
Well, thank you again for joining us. I know it's a really busy day up on Capitol Hill. We really appreciate you digging into some of these topics with us. And thank you for tuning in to AP Newsmakers. Have a great day.